chaos, hatred, intolerance, violence. These behaviors led to extreme conflicts in Boston from the mid-1960s through to the late 1970s. Displayed towards those with a different skin color than their own, people at this time made their definition of racism with these words. Problems with segregation started when it was realized that everyone deserves the same rights, although Boston busing began much later. Busing was the idea of taking students to and from different parts of the city in order to racially balance schools. This is the story of the trial, error, and eventually success of the Boston school system in order to desegregate schools. This is Boston Busing and School Desegregation by Alicia Barry. In early August of 1964, the Racial Imbalance Act was passed, saying that schools with more than 50% non-white student population were racially imbalanced and must be desegregated. As a result, the State Board of Education requested that the Boston School Committee make a plan for desegregation of the students. The committee voted 3-2 for a plan that was later rejected by the State Board. Boston's financial aid was stopped, and the State Board proposed a plan which was refused by the school committee. The plans went back and forth until August of 1966. None of the plans between 1967 and 1970 worked well. Boston state funding was again suspended on May 25th of 1971. The Boston School Committee devised a new plan and entered it on June 15th, which provided steps in order to ensure the mixing of races in 4 new elementary schools by the names of Lee, Marshall, Curley, and Trotter. It also suggested more building projects, changes to the open enrollment option, and 1,170 more students to be bused. With more debates, the school committee voted to make changes to the open enrollment option, making it so only students whose transfers would reduce racial imbalance would be allowed. The majority of the school committee also agreed to alter district areas in Dorchester in order for white elementary students to be sent to the new Lee and Marshall schools as opposed to all white schools at an equal distance. With all of the action taken, Boston state funding was returned. On September 8th of 1971, a new school year began, and few students, black or white, attended the Lee School, and there were violent attacks outside of and around several school buildings in Dorchester. On September 21st, the school committee held a meeting where their Dorchester plans were shot to the ground. When the school committee voted again towards the end of the meeting, the majority decided to end parts of the plan concerning the Lee School. Boston's funding was once again suspended, and lawsuits began on top of all the other trouble, taking 2 years to fix. A group led by John Finger, who was an advisor to the State Board, created a plan which divided the city of Boston into geocodes. This plan, known as the Finger Plan, also created a grade arrangement which allowed all schools at the same level to have the same grades, which were K-5 for primary, 6-8 for intermediate or junior high school, and 9-12 for high school. The next 7 months were spent by the Education Planning Center, the EPC, trying to smooth out the small problems with the plan, including transferring all of the needed student files, where to assign teachers and staff, the need for extra safety precautions, contracts with bus companies, and routes. Not many of these problems were solved by May 15, 1974. This caused the ruling of Judge Garrity on June 21, 1974, which said that the Boston School Committee hadn't followed the Racial Imbalance Act correctly and intervened in the situation. He directed the committee to use the plan that the Board of Education had created until a citywide plan could be created and approved by the committee. Louise Day Hicks, a city council member, and other whites formed the group against busing called Restore Our Alienated Rights, ROAR. Phase 1 of the plan began in September of 1974. The plan had the biggest problems with the mixing of South Boston High School and Roxbury High. On the first day of school, September 12th, attendance at South Boston High School shows 216 students, 133 of them black and 83 of them white, out of an expected 1,900 students. All over the city, only 62% of students expected attended school. Buses were stoned, and one section of South Boston High School, called the L Street Annex, reported injuries to a bus driver, 6 black children, and a monitor on the first day alone. One wall in South Boston bore the message, "We shall continue to resist," referring to the busing and desegregation in 3-foot red letters. As the buses drove through, people stood on sidewalks with bananas, calling the blacks monkeys and telling them to go home. They called them some of the worst names imaginable and screamed, saying that they weren't welcome. Police were ordered to escort buses, keep the streets empty, and to stop gatherings of 3 or more near schools because Mayor White had made them illegal. Many people to this day wonder why people were so terrible and rude to the opposite race. And of course, there may be opinions, but the question will never be answered completely.
Well, I think the root of racism is ignorance. It's just ignorance. People who don't want to deal with people as individuals.
We humans just like to rank order.
At this point, Mayor Kevin H. White wanted to bring in 125 federal marshals, but Judge Garrity refused, saying that the local police had to be utilized before going to such extremes. White then went to Governor Sargent, who gave him 400 State and Metropolitan District Commission MDC police. After more violence, Sargent got 450 National Guardsmen and stationed most of them in a federal facility in South Boston, but White would not allow them to go out onto the streets. In mid-December, Judge Garrity required the police to give him daily reports on the activity in South Boston. He also made the law about gathering around South Boston High School more strict, saying that groups of 3 or more were not allowed within 100 yards of any South Boston school or within 50 yards of any Boston school. The school committee was ordered to write a set of rules against derogatory language towards other races. In preparation of the beginning of Phase 2 of Garrity's plan, ideas were taken from the Citywide Parent Advisory Council, the CPAC, and the financial aid suspension was ended. During the summer, the school committee was ordered by Garrity to make a new desegregation plan by December 16th. The EPC then planned to bus 31,248 students out of a total estimated 71,957 for the 1975 to 1976 school year. They also suggested the grade arrangement to be used in vocational and examination schools, handicapped students to be given more attention than ever before, and a timeline in which everything should happen. They also made suggestions that there should be 6 high schools instead of 10, and that schools should be grouped to combined districts. They recommended the blending of Roxbury and Dorchester, and South Boston, North Dorchester, and the South End. This plan was rejected on December 16th by John McDonough, Paul Ellison, and John Kerrigan. After granting Garrity with the rejected EPC plan, the school committee attorney left the case. The school committee majority refused to support the EPC plan, and Garrity held them in civil contempt and set January 8th as a final deadline for a plan. If they exceeded the deadline, they would be penalized with weekly fines. After losing an appeal to make them free of what Garrity had asked, McDonough, Kerrigan, and Ellison made a plan on January 7th. With this plan, parents were allowed to decide whether they wanted to keep their children in district schools or transfer them to magnet schools. Children whose parents didn't have an opinion for either side would be bused. Seeing the effort put into this plan, Garrity discontinued the citations and granted the school committee 3 weeks to fix the plan. At the end of March, a new plan was produced following several weeks of meetings. On April 10th, a slightly revised plan was presented, and on May 10th, the final plan was finished. The Phase 2 plan included community districts, 8 of them, all with the same grade arrangement. A citywide district, also with the same grade arrangement. Ideas from citizens, some schools offering lessons in a different language, programs for mentally and or physically impaired children in all schools, 32 schools to be closed, a limit of 2 high schools per district, and spots in citywide high schools for those who didn't have a place in their district. The plan for Phase 2 also required 21,000 students to be bused. The plan did not, however, give details on busing or costs, so these were left for the EPC to figure out by July when they were replaced by the Office of Implementation. Dr. Reed was removed from South Boston High School in the week of December 9th and replaced by Joseph McDonough. The students of South Boston High School were infuriated, and they boycotted school once more. Only 18 whites attended school so they could play sports 3 days later. Phase 2B started on May 3rd, 1976, and was very similar to the plan for Phase 2. Although it seemed everything was settling, according to a South Boston High School graduate of 1977, there were still issues. She said that the black students had no input in the planning of the prom whatsoever, so they boycotted, and there wasn't one black student that attended the prom in '77. Phase 3 for 1977 to 1978 was released in the spring of 1977. This plan included kindergarten children being bused, a new high school in Madison Park, 4 schools to be closed, 2 schools to be built, and guidelines for when everything should happen. Judge Garrity became less involved in the fall of 1977 as everything started to settle down. With everything that went on during this time, it's hard to believe that everything would ever be back to as normal as it is today. Racism was so common, though it isn't today.
The one thing I can say is I cannot tell you that racism has been eliminated, but I can tell you this, it is socially unacceptable.